Hello, my name is Scott Neigh, and this is Talking Radical's Book Talk project. Today, I'm going to be talking about Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty by Jennifer M. Silva, published in 2013 by Oxford University Press. This book sets out to answer the question, what kinds of experiences do working class people have of coming of age in contemporary North America? And in the process of answering that question, it also answers, or at least explores in a more grounded and empirical way than you usually see, the question of how do all of those broad social changes that we tend to group together under the phrase neoliberalism shape and impact the lives of working class people beyond just that side of life that we tend to reify as the economic, but in very intimate and personal ways, and how do working class people experience, navigate, and make meaning from all of that. So Jennifer Silva is a sociologist, and the book is based on a research project that involved doing long, in-depth interviews with 100 young adults. These are people who seem to be in their 20s and early 30s. They are black people and white people, men and women, and they're people who live in a couple of different post-industrial cities in the United States. And Silva uses these interviews and draws out from the generous amount of rich, detailed material that she has collected to understand the lives of the people that she talked to and to understand how broader social relations and institutions have shaped the lives and the choices and the possibilities and even the very selves of the people that she's talking to. And also, what do these people do to navigate all of this? What strategies do they use? And how do they understand it all? And in doing this, I think the most important thing about this book, the thing that I really value about it, is that it examines the social world kind of across scales. So we often treat the individual as over here and separate, and the social as something completely separate and over here. But this looks in a really grounded way about the connections, the ways in which those scales are not in fact separate, but are very much integrated into each other. So I think it's partly valuable because of the way that it treats neoliberalism. So often books that use neoliberalism as a frame for understanding the world, like I said, they tend to treat it as being an economic phenomenon, and this treats it as something much broader, something that has transformed social life in its entirety and not just in terms of economic things. And I think most crucially, from my perspective, it talks about the how of all of that. How do these large-scale institutional and social changes percolate down into the everyday lives of ordinary people? And I think that that how is something that we need to examine a lot more. So I'm very glad to have encountered this book. In terms of the writing, it's from that subset of academic writing that is unexciting and very careful, which I think are good things when it comes to scholarly writing, and that are relatively accessible and easy for the non-specialist to read. I think what I particularly valued in how this was written was the way in which the interview material is integrated into the analysis. And that means in terms of the selection and use of direct quotations, the selection and use of examples that is done very seamlessly and in a way that really advances the argument. But I think even more, I mean in terms of storytelling. So in something like this, like when you have a long detailed interview, there's no guarantee that it's going to come in a form that gives you lots of big usable quotes. So often a lot of what you do to use it is paraphrasing and summarizing. And I really appreciated the way in which in this book it was done in a way that didn't just convey facts, but that sort of gave a flavor and a feel of the lives of the people involved. And that can be a really useful thing for drawing the reader in. So in terms of the findings of this study, it should be no surprise, given the scope of social change in North America in the last 50 years, that the experiences that working class people have in terms of coming of age, becoming adults, have changed a lot in that time as well. And it probably shouldn't be a surprise, though it may be a bit more of a surprise, that some really core aspects of how working class people understand themselves and understand the world have shifted in that time as well. So if you look back, say 50 years ago, to the height of the economic boom that followed the Second World War, working class men, particularly white men, but certainly not only white men, could reasonably expect to find a job that was stable and that paid a pretty decent wage. And in part because of that stability, working class people could expect a reasonably standard set of markers in their lives that sort of marked out the stages of becoming an adult. Probably graduating high school, getting a job, getting married, having kids. A little later on, access to post-secondary education became broader for working class people, so for some people that was integrated into it too. But for the most part, it was a pretty standard set of markers and norms. Now, there were definitely downsides to this as well. Certainly people who fell outside of these norms could face difficulties. And there were other things that went along with it that weren't necessarily caused by or causing these. Gender roles tended to be fairly rigidly defined. There were expectations around working class masculinity that tended to, around sort of distancing from emotion and from engaging the world in emotional ways. There were a variety of things, and there was a greater sense of collective identity, collective possibility, and none of this means to romanticize those experiences 50 years ago. Certainly, white supremacy and patriarchy were even more intense and rigid than they are today. But it's to make the point that for whatever other changes existed, back then, distributed as it was in racialized and gendered ways, there was more possibility for at least a subset of working class people to access the kinds of material resources that they needed to have relatively stable lives and a sense of sort of collective belonging and purpose and possibility. So if you look at today, things are very different. Again, not all of that is bad. The loosening of some of those really densely enforced norms around life expectation, gendered expectation, sexual expectation, those are definitely positive things. But another aspect of what has changed in the intervening decades is that the kinds of jobs that made that sort of stability possible, that kind of stable, well-paid working class job just doesn't exist to nearly the same extent as it did 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But that's part of neoliberalism, is the change in employment possibilities, so that jobs today are very much more, and in some places almost exclusively, precarious, more likely to be temporary, more likely to be low paid, more likely to be non-union. And especially in the kinds of post-deindustrialized cities where these interviews were done. But that kind of change, changes in the economy, changes in employment, that's not the only kind of broad change that has come under the banner of neoliberalism. Another aspect of those broader changes have to do with the kinds of institutions that earlier generations of working class struggle won in terms of offering some supports and stability and security. And with the decades of neoliberalism, and to a certain extent in Canada for sure, and an even greater extent in the United States, those institutions have, some of them, been completely destroyed, and others of them have been cut and attacked and defunded and partially or completely privatized, and in many other ways distorted, so that the way that they work has changed. So that the way that those institutions of social democracy worked at their peak in North America, and it was a very limited peak here, they offered material supports, not universally or evenly accessible, it's very racialized how access to that was given, but they offered to many people in the working class supports, material supports, but they also offered a kind of intrusive moral regulation, an intrusion into people's lives, regulating people's lives. And what's happened under neoliberalism is that the actual material support is much less, and the amount of intrusion and regulation and the punitive character of many of them has greatly increased. And the way that that showed up in these interviews is that almost universally, among the 100 people that Silva interviewed, almost universally, their experiences of education, of post-secondary education, of healthcare settings, of social services, is as inadequate, as untrustworthy, as opaque and hard to understand, and as likely to betray. So the lesson that all of these folks learned in their experiences of these institutions is that you cannot depend on these institutions. And similarly, they also learn, because their lives are unstable and the lives of everyone around them is similarly unstable, because they cannot trust the institutions that might employ them, they cannot trust the institutions that might offer services and supports, is that they can't really trust the people around them either, because the people around them have similarly challenging and precarious lives. This is a very, very different set of circumstances for working class people to come of age than existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. Even granted that there are positive changes in that interim as well, this change in ability to expect and experience solidarity and trust and mutual support is a huge, huge, huge difference. So how did the people that Silva talked to make sense of all of this? Well, there are a few different ways that they did that. So one small subset. So there were people from across the demographics that she talked to, and this is actually a very tragic finding, not surprising to me, but tragic in the way that it played out in so many lives. The only institution that they could depend on to a certain extent was the military. So many people, whether it was dealing with debt, whether it was trying to access education, various other things, they joined the military. And that was across the demographics that she talked to. But she found that a certain subset of mostly white men were able to use their experience in the military to access some of the only remaining stable, well-paid working class jobs in their communities. And for the most part, that meant becoming a cop or becoming a firefighter. And it was mostly white guys who had been in the military that were able to do that. And she found that this small subset of people had views of the world, experiences of the world that were a lot more similar to what they would have had 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. The other small subset that was distinct, she found, grounded their understanding of all of this in faith. So lots of the people that she talked to identified as Christian, went to church, and so on. But it was particularly a small subset of black women that she interviewed for whom faith just sort of permeated the ways that they made sense of all of this. For the vast majority of people that she interviewed, including most of the white men and most of the black women and most of everybody else, the way that they made sense of their lives and of the world was through a model that she describes as therapeutic. And what that means is that they understood the core of their identity and the heart of their process of becoming adults through an emotional journey, through initial early life hardship, whether that is sort of family of origin stuff, maybe abuse, maybe addiction, maybe deprivation, maybe abandonment, various things, and of overcoming those obstacles emotionally. And this was a narrative that wasn't focused on any material changes in circumstances. It was focused on cultivating an emotional change in relationship to those circumstances. Now, there are a number of things about this that are striking and remarkable. So one of the things is how intensely neoliberal this is. The sort of values and ideas promoted with neoliberalism, they focus on individualism, they focus on not changing society, but on changing yourself to adapt to society, and this is very much in line with all of that. Now, and I say that in a way that's not blaming the people who do this. They're picking up the tools that are on offer and adapting to the circumstances that they have. What I'm blaming here is the institutions and the social relations that make this the only option that people have. So it's very neoliberal. It's also very different than what existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. In some ways, in that earlier era, having that kind of psychologized, emotion-focused, individualized understanding of self was actually a marker of class distinction. That was something in an earlier version of it anyway, that in that era was a marker of being middle class. And for working class people in that earlier era, there was no particular attraction to having that understanding of self. There was no need for it. It didn't give them anything. And often they weren't able to access it even if they had wanted to cultivate that kind of sense and account of self. So that in some ways, it was a marker of difference in that earlier era. Whereas today, it's very much something that this study has found that working class people have taken up and make great use of as they navigate their lives. So that's a big change. But I think what the most profoundly striking thing about all of this is that if you look at how this happened, the mechanism through which it happened, if you look at all of those institutions that in earlier eras, whether, for better or worse, even given the social regulation, even given the boundaries to accessing the resources, what they did was that was positive was they gave material resources for people to live their lives. And in the neoliberal era, they don't do that anymore, not nearly as much or in a way that provides the same sort of security. But what they do provide, whether you're looking at schools or healthcare settings or social services, is they provide all of the conceptual and practical resources for people to cultivate this sort of therapeutic self. And, I mean, who can blame people? That's all that's on offer, so you take it up and you make use of it in the best way that you can. But it, again, is a real indication of how neoliberal change to the institution trickles down through the functioning of the institution and changes the experiences and the sense of self and so on of working class people in North America. Now, obviously, there are lots of political implications to this, and you can certainly look at the way that, particularly in the United States, but it has a manifestation in Canada as well, way that electoral politics play out, for example. The book doesn't really go into detail into that, although it does draw out, for example, many of the people in her sample were quite hostile to the idea of collective ways of addressing problems. That based on their experience of constant betrayal by institutions, they just saw no point in pursuing that kind of way of dealing with problems, there was a real ingrained understanding that changing yourself was all that could be expected. So it doesn't explore that in detail, but there are certainly political implications. I'm not really sure yet what lessons exactly I would draw from this. I think that one value of the book is for middle-class lefties who, I mean, we often fail to understand the experiences of working-class people, and this is a way to try and cultivate some of that understanding. I think also on the left, people of all backgrounds, it's easy to fall into drawing from traditions of social change that were originally developed 30, 50, 100 years ago in a way that doesn't really adapt them for how the world has changed, how people have changed in that time. And I think that the account in this book is one way to kind of start figuring out some of that inappropriately applied methods and misunderstandings and to addressing those in how we do our work. And again, I think it's the examination of the how in the connection between these broader social changes and individual experiences and senses of self and so on that is really, really crucial in this book. And I think also there is something that is somewhat hopeful about the findings as well. That anytime that you can sort of look at history and see that something has changed in a certain way, even if it's changed in a way that you'd rather it hadn't, or if it's sort of a complicated mix of positive and negative changes, it's a sign that things can change. And I think this is really a sign that large-scale changes in how we understand the world and how we understand ourselves, those can happen. They do happen. And the one piece of empirical evidence that she draws, that Silva herself draws from the interviews as a sign of hope, is that one of the people that she interviewed had, through his experiences and through his encounters with various things, developed a sense of himself and the world that wasn't traditional working class masculinity, it wasn't faith-based, it wasn't this therapeutic model that was the vast majority of the people that she had talked to. He had come to understand himself as a revolutionary socialist and as someone who was very invested in collective ways of radically challenging the problems that people face today. And I think, whatever you think of the specific politics named there, that is a sign of hope that it is possible to, of course, it's possible to cultivate collective transformative visions for social change in the current environment. We just need to actually understand the current moment and the way that people experience the current moment, the way that people navigate their lives, the way that institutions shape all of that. And only by doing that will we have a chance of growing the movements that we need to win that kind of social change. So that, again, is Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty by Jennifer M. Silva. I will link below to my various social media presences, so follow those if you're interested in learning more about me and about my work. And of course, I encourage you to learn more about the Talking Radical project, particularly Talking Radical Radio. And I will be back again soon with another instance of Talking Radical's Book Talk.